Sumeya Loonat. I'm a senior international student lecturer. I'm also a doctoral researcher, so I'm looking at critical perspectives that look at the experiences of minoritized international and home students. And I've got my PhD supervisor with me.
That's right, kicking and screaming. I was bullied into it.
Yeah, and we're also part of the Decolonising DMU project, which aims to build an anti-racist university. So these are some of the things that we're going to look at today, so I'm going to go through them in more detail. But before I really do go into the presentation, you'll notice that I've used a lot of artwork in my presentation, and this is basically to honour the work of Hiba Zargood. So she's a Palestinian school teacher, and she's also an artist, and her messages and her paintings are all about peace and preserving her culture. And I thought it'd be really important for us to honour and pay tribute to her and her children. Unfortunately, she was killed in October. So for me, I didn't feel right talking about coloniality, talking about the erasure of marginalized voices, the subjugation of communities and oppression without referring to the wider struggles beyond UK higher education. So I hope you'll enjoy the pictures as much as I've really enjoyed looking at her artwork. So back to my positionality, I mentioned I'm doing my doctoral studies, and I really wanted to talk about the importance of positionality within our research. So who are we when we're doing our research? What is our voice? Who hears us? So I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of my positionality. Our own experiences shape our view of the world. So my position as a minoritized, able-bodied, multilingual woman researcher from a working class background means that I inhibit multiple intersecting identities within and outside the university. I can speak multiple languages, but for the most part of my life, I felt that this was not an important part of my identity, because the languages that I speak, in addition to English, were never really considered to be the norm because they're not Eurocentric. So it's only recently that I've started owning up to my identity and being really proud of my background, my cultures, languages that I know and speak. So my background is in English language teaching. So I've been an English language lecturer for about 10 years, but my subject expertise does not match embodied representations of who I am within the field that I'm in. I was born in this country, but I feel like I'm regularly othered in many forms, including my speech and body. So although I'm a native English speaker, it's the norm for people to comment on my linguistic abilities and assume that I do not use English as a first language, or this regular habitual use of policing within my language use. So these type of linguistic microaggressions are just one one dimension to many other stereotypes that I regularly endure. So it's not just the way that I speak, and this is what's also really important within the context of my research, it's the way speech and language is framed towards me. So as an example, if I'm talking about the workplace, I will very frequently get mistaken as a member of, as a student or somebody who's lost in the institution. And these experiences are not just unique to myself. These have been very frequently reported by other academics of colour. For example, Bernard 2017, Johnson and Salisbury 2018. They wrote a whole article on why you're supposed to be here. So these frequent instances of mistaken identity uncover these hidden and implicit messages of racial microaggressions that reinforce internal feelings of consciousness and self-condemnation, because it makes me question the places I can and cannot inhibit. And these will ultimately end up making me feel like a space invader, which is something that I think still resonates. It's a term that was coined by Poor back in 2004, and it's still just as relevant today. So all of these experiences that I've had within my own, so my lived experiences have really shaped the way in which I do my PhD research, because I share from a lot of the research and the data collection. I found that there was a lot of intersectional commonalities between myself and my participants within these kind of identity markers, but I felt like there was a safe space, but at the same time, I was very careful not to essentialize or homogenize their experiences. And then Richard's going to just talk about it.
Yeah, I talk about my positionality. And which is like super challenging, right? Because like that kind of doesn't, like my identity is never mistaken, really, inside the institution, white male professor, been in the institute, been incarcerated inside education institutions since I was 4. Other than 6 months doing furniture removals and 6 months backpacking around India, that's pretty much been it. I do a whole load of stuff outside the university. I'm a governor of a pupil referral unit for primary and secondary. I'm a mentor for a child who's looked after child in care. Done a lot of other stuff. I would say that working with Sumeya and there are 3 other students of colour, black students, is probably the most rewarding work that I've done within the institution because it challenges all of that. Because also my writing comes from a Marxist humanist perspective. I write about academic alienation. I was really interested in your work on critical hope because my last book was called The Hopeless University. So I write about how we process hopelessness as well within that space. But I think that gets enriched, that gets decomposed, and it gets enriched through work with international students, students of colour, with PhD students who are working in this space, because it deeply challenges those kind of identities. And I guess the last thing I would sort of say within that is we both work on this decolonising DMU project, but increasingly I am minded. I asked the question earlier, picking up on Hyacinth's point from earlier about re-existence and resistance of Uriah about being anti-colonial, and that comes from some work of people like Fred Logan in the States, talking about the imperative of being not just decolonial but anti-colonial. So that's kind of part of my positionality within this. Oh, it's me again, isn't it? Sorry. Sorry. One of the things that's been super interesting in supervisions with Sumeya has been the ways in which a range of theoretical lenses have played out. So is the work in which we're engaged decolonial? Are we thinking, is our critical response post-colonial? Is it anti-colonial? At what level are we bringing in critical race as a kind of set of heuristics to try and understand lived experiences? And how does that play out in relation to speech and language then, given where those may come from and the spaces inside which we're trying to work? So these are some of the kind of, I guess, the headline statements of things that we've been thinking about in kind of supervision around your project, but also, and not, interestingly, within an institutional decolonising project. That is not the space inside which these conversations generally happen. But some of the things within that, then, I guess, will speak for the next slide. And they are about, what do we do about the Western canon? I'm mindful of that point from earlier about, how far we travel to engage with that. Also about this issue around kind of power, domination, subjugation, in particular within universities that will claim that they are the most liberal institutions in the land, whilst at the same time they are toxic and degrading for certain bodies in particular, and how they then reproduce kind of structures and cultures of whiteness. And how do we understand whiteness? In particular, given that it is kind of denied by the power structures within the institution, and yet a whole range of and then tries to co-opt the idea of the student experience or the lived experience of international students within that. So these are some of the things that are kind of disrupting our work, I think, and then we're trying to disrupt the institution through that. Let's do the next one. I mean, then get back to you then, and then you're much more interested. Part of this is that a lot of this work then takes place inside a context that is deluded, effectively. Sumeya's used the kind of term here around institutional delusion, and some of this is about that kind of schizophrenic positionality that the institution holds, that actually it isn't entangled, its binaries are entangled and play off each other. It is both and, it is not either or. So within that space, in particular, the relationships I think that Sumeya will talk to around some of the stuff that popped up this morning, home versus international, how those are projections of what an idealized kind of international or home student might be onto individual bodies within that. And also, I think, for us, thinking about the Decolonising the ANU project, this penultimate point here around our ability, or an institution that relies on the flow of money, funds, resources, in particular from the majority world into a settler colonial space. How is it reconciling that binary? Because both are existing at the same time, and I'm not sure it can. Oh, there is one more slide of me, and sorry, we've had a lot of images from the press. We're all very live to what is happening in the media in relation to how toxic the environment can be for bodies that do not look like mine and do not have my privilege and my way of navigating through. And that also then, that situates this work, but I am not sure, but that is not in the committee work I do inside the university, for instance. That is not talked about. There is a very deep and violent silence around this. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think what we're trying to say is how coloniality permeates through all different types of structures, institutional cultures and practices, but also the way in which students end up becoming orientalized. And coloniality is very pervasive through the way students are subjectified. And I find that within my research, I found that there's this kind of absence of voices. So there's such a focus on data-driven metrics, and this was spoken about in the earlier presentations. So and I don't know if you're familiar, but when we tend to look at the experiences of international students, it's always looking at international student barometers, and I find this as well with home students, like the awarding gap for minoritized students. Like there's not as much focus on the actual student journey, on the lived experiences. I find that everything ends up being about data, metrics, and how to kind of narrow a gap. And I think that there's a lot of agency that gets lost in the process of doing this, because what happens also is that I found that when it comes to research with international students, traditionally everything was from a very deficit situation, and there's been lots of research to highlight this. Jenna, Sylvie, all your work's been really instrumental in developing my thinking around how international students are homogenized and why it's actually really dangerous to do that. Because I also find that within my work, as part of the Decolonising DMU project and as part of my actual work role as well, I find that when it comes to the experiences of international students, it's always issues of adaptation, cultural shocks, places where the burden of adaptation is usually placed on the student. But then that means that we ignore and we neglect issues of race and racism. And we end up gaslighting students. So when it comes to international students, it's never really about issues of race and racism. That's what I've been finding within literature. It's, the mainstream discourse is very much based on cultural issues of adjustment. But I think that the international student experience should be documented through like a decolonial, critical and ethical lens, which sometimes an international lens alone just doesn't do it justice. And also just to kind of re-emphasize that the reason why we should use these kind of lens to analyze the student experiences, because there are overlapping barriers between home and international minoritized students, such as spaces of identity, safe spaces, belonging. And I think that these are themes that can be reconciled within these constructions of students. And that brings me to the next point. So during my PhD research, one area that was really kind of critical and really became more and more emerging was issues of language. And I found that the intersections of language and race raised critical questions about power structures. And I think that this doesn't get the justice it deserves when we're looking at the experiences of international students. So we tend to frame issues of the discrimination based on language as just microaggressions. I think that they're much more serious than that. We need to call it what it is, and that is linguistic racism. So issues of language policing, particularly for international students, issues around this conceptualization of what makes a native speaker, and even within my PhD research, the amount of importance that was given by my participants on issues around accent and discriminations. All of this really does reflect the realities and practices of whiteness. And just to give you a really quick example, the Office for Students have now published guidelines on spelling, punctuation and grammar. And when I was doing the slide, like I remembered that, yeah, I'm not saying we shouldn't, accuracy is of course very important. Technical English is very important, but how is this being viewed? I argue that it's coming from a place of the white gaze and the white listening subject. And then a lot of work has already been done around the white listening subject by Flores and Rosa, where time's coming up. So last slide, I just really want to say that to make research with international students more meaningful, I think it's really important that we develop students' agency. We can do this through the use of storytelling and counter narratives. Why this is really important is it challenges the majoritarian discourse that you see out there. You actually learn from your participants when you're taking this type of approach, which has been borrowed from critical race theory. And again, I really relied heavily on Yosso's model. She's a critical race, Yosso's a critical race theorist, developed a community cultural wealth model. But what I'm interested in is how can we adapt this model that was published back in 2005. They talked about various forms of capital. I'm very interested in the linguistic forms of capital. So how do we see linguistic capital as a source of strength for our international students? And again, just going back to the keynotes today, thinking of our students as epistemic partners, not just research subjects, and thinking about the problematic language that we might ourselves have previously used. I remember when I started this journey, when I reflect back on it now, some of the language that I used to describe my students was quite problematic. And there's a lot of research that highlights how we position students as weak, challenge, full of barriers, but I think we need to really try and develop our work so that our research is rooted in principles that embody compassion and dignity. Thank you. I forgot to say, I'll just end with a quote from Bell Hooks because this really speaks to me every time I enter the classroom, every time I do my research. And if you want to hear more from me or Richard, you can follow us on, oh, it's not Twitter, it's X.